Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Quickening, which is not a Highlander reference. It is actually episode 24 of season 4 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. This video was the winner of my Patreon only poll. It is for those who are very kind enough to support my channel on Patreon, get their own poll, and they selected. Actually, this episode tied. It was a very indecisive poll. This episode actually tied with two other episodes, The Offspring from Next Generation and Twilight from Enterprise. However, as always, I reserve the right to be the tiebreaker. So out of those three episodes, which it was a close call for me, but ultimately decided to go with The Quickening. Now, The Quickening is the episode where Bashir answers a distress call and he finds a planet that is devastated by a plague known as the Blight. It's been there for centuries. It was genetically engineered by the Jem'Hadar to punish this population for defying the Dominion. Bashir comes in all arrogant, sure that he can cure the disease in a week, and he ends up failing very badly. In fact, getting a bunch of people killed to the point where he gives up and wants to just give up and leave. However, a nurse that he befriended named Ikoria really believes him in, and she gives him the strength to keep going, so he decides to stay on the planet, in which he finally doesn't find a cure, but he does find a vaccine that eliminates the blight within the young people, the babies who are before they're born, so all pregnant women can take this vaccine and their babies will be free of this disease. So it was a halfway victory, but not quite where he wanted to be, and the episode ends with him in the infirmary still struggling but failing to find a cure. So those familiar with my channel will know that this is one of my favorite episodes of, well, basically of the entire Star Trek franchise. I think this was, if you see my top 10 or top 30 or top 50 or however top Deep Space Nine episodes, this was in my top 5. I believe I had it at number 3, just behind In the Pale Moonlight and Duet. So that's how much I love this episode, and watching it again, yeah, I'm reaffirmed. And I think it's really underrated. I think most people will say, yeah, it's good. It's a good episode. They would give it like 8 out of 10 and put it like... I think there was one website I found that rated it as the 69th best episode of Deep Space Nine. I mean, 69... Just, forgetting about the stupid, childish, immature jokes. I mean, it's a decent number, but come on. In my opinion, this episode's way, way better than that. I think a lot of people underrate this episode. Now, some other people who also really love this episode is people who worked on it, like Alexander Siddig, who plays Dr. Bashir. He names this as one of his favorite episodes that he absolutely loved. Terry Farrell, who plays Jessie Dax, who also had an important role in this episode, also named this as one of her favorite episodes. Ira Stephen Bear also said that this was one of the best episodes of the show. He thought everything came together, like from the script to the production to everything came together really nicely. Renee, sorry, I'm going to butcher his name, Renee Echevarria, who was a writer on Deep Space Nine. I believe that's how you say his name. I'm sure it's wrong, actually, but that is my attempt. Anyway, he named this as the second best episode that he ever worked on, behind The Visitor. So that's how much he liked this episode. So this episode was the idea of Ira Stephen Bear, who saw a movie called Restoration, which came out in 1995. Now, I had never heard of this movie. I looked it up, watched the trailer for it. Like, it stars Robert Downey Jr. And Neil. No, I was going to say Neil Young, but who's the guy from Jurassic Park? Sam Neill. Sam Neill, he was in this movie, and so was Hugh Grant. More have had a cameo. Meg Ryan was in this movie. I had never heard of this movie, but apparently it's about like Robert Downey Jr. being this like it's taking place in England during the Great Plague, and Robert Downey Jr. is like this rich royalty having all these orgies and whatnot, but then he gets kicked out and has to like deal with the plague and ends up finding himself blah 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 blah. I never heard of this movie, but anyway, apparently our Stephen Bear was inspired by that movie and came up with the idea that Bashir should go to a planet that's ravaged by an epidemic that he just can't cure, no matter how hard he tries. But Bear himself apparently was too busy to write the episode himself, so he gave that duty to Nareen Shankar, who I hadn't actually realized worked on Deep Space Nine at all. He was a writer mainly in the last 2 seasons of Star Trek Next Generation. He, of course, nowadays in present time, is the showrunner for The Expanse, my favorite show currently airing. So he wrote this episode, which I didn't know until just recently. And so he changed it a little bit from Burr's original idea, because Ira Stephen Bear wanted this to be more of an AIDS metaphor, because apparently there was someone working in the office who had recently died of AIDS. So Burr was thinking about that, but Shankar kind of changed the script a bit, so it wasn't really focused on that. Which I think is fine. Let's take the script where it goes. And then Renee Echevarria, sorry, totally butchered it that time. There's no mistake. Anyway, he did a rewrite of this episode, or uncredited, they say. It's polished, not a rewrite, but a polish. And this episode was directed by Renee, another Renee whose last name is hard to pronounce, Renee Auberginois, who plays Odo. He actually directed this episode. So yeah, that's pretty interesting, and he talked about how he actually felt more comfortable. This is the second episode he directed, and that he felt more comfortable working on it, even though there were a lot of issues. Apparently there was a flood or a rain that destroyed the set, so they had to delay production for like 3 days, and there was like a crap ton of extras to work with, but he actually said he enjoyed it. So, yeah. Why do I love this episode so much? To me, this is really typical of Deep Space Nine. In fact, apparently there's a BBC reviewer wrote that The Quickening is an episode dealing with the catastrophic effects of a plague the Jimitar have unleashed on the planet that resisted Dominion rule. Is arguably one of the best examples of how Deep Space Nine departure from typical track pattern can produce great TV. In fact, I would go as far as to say, and I think our Stephen Bear said something similar, that this was actually unique to television. And it's definitely unique to Star Trek, because usually when you have like a crisis, a plague or whatnot, the hero comes in and struggles, but eventually saves the day. Where here, they focus more, really this is the character story for Bashir, and I think this is the quintessential episode for Bashir. I think this is really the turning point of his character, because for the first couple of seasons he was portrayed as this arrogant, know-nothing doctor, and now season 3 and 4 maybe not as bad, but he still had that flair to him, and this is the episode I think he completely lost that flair, where he still is cheerful and optimistic, but he's not necessarily arrogant like he used to be. So I'd like to think that this is actually an ongoing, like this episode has ramifications for his character going forward, and that this was basically like a really key peak moment in his life. And it's a great character story on its own. Is that Bashir, that he really, from his experience, now granted, like this isn't unearned, but he felt from his previous experience that he could just come in and nip this thing in the bud and just like cure this virus thing in a week. And he even, and Dox at first, to be fair, kind of encourages him, because when they first get there and Kira's like, oh, there's Jim Hadar in the way, we gotta leave, Bashir's like, no, I want to stay here for a week. You can go hide in a nebula so that Jim Hadar don't see you. But you remember that other planet, something 3 or whatever, when there was this plague going on? We just showed up there and we found the cure in 3 days and we distributed it in a week. So a week should be good. We're fine. We'll cure this thing in a week. And Jadzia actually encouraged him. She's like, oh yeah, we solved that thing in a week. That's fine. We'll be good. And a week passes, and not only are they not any closer to finding a cure, but he got a lot of people killed. And at the end of the, when the cure comes up, Bashir's like talking to Dax about how arrogant he was. He couldn't believe how arrogant it was that this genetically enhanced plague. And I think that's where it's important to define that this was from the Dominion, because the Dominion has been shown and portrayed to have technology that is beyond the Federation's capability. So it makes sense they'd be able to genetically engineer plague. It'd be pretty damn fucking hard to find a cure for. And so Bashir is coming to terms with the fact that he was so arrogant that he thought he'd be able to cure this genetically enhanced by a superior organization with superior technology, that he'd be able to cure it in a week when these people have been suffering through it for 2 centuries. Now, granted, the planet they go to is, and they make a point to show that the people are living destitution and squalor, and that their technology level is quite low. However, they also point out that they actually used to have really high advanced technology, and they used to travel the stars, but that was before their planet was decimated by this plague. And honestly, I think this is, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, I think this is a better use of that scenario of a world being decimated by a plague than the Vidians on Voyager, because that was the whole point too. Because the whole point of the Vidians on Voyager is, the thought process there is, what if the Black Plague or the plague, whatever, what if we never recovered from it and we were still suffering from it now, and it became to define us, which I won't even get into present day 2020 and how we're feeling about that, but anyway, let's not talk about that. But but they played the Vidians off more as like villains and like they steal people's organs and stuff, where this, it kind of has them. You do have some characters like Lennar Pell that the Doctor fell in love with, who was a bit more sympathetic and whatnot, but they didn't focus on that very much. For the most part, they turned it into like a criminal enterprise, and they were just the bad guy. Where here, there's no bad guys here. There's no good guys or bad guys in this episode at all. Even though, some people may mistakenly think that Trevian is the bad guy because he is a bit adversarial. They do have a bit of a conflict with Bashir, but clearly he's not the bad guy, and they have a very sort of interesting relationship, and I love the way that they portray Trevian, by the way. But I'll get more into that later. But the point is, this is a much more nuanced look of a world that's been completely destroyed and decimated by the plague. And as much as I would love to make analogies to modern day, our current situations, episode's not really analogous to that, which, came out almost 3 decades ago, so you can't blame it for not being analogous to that. Although there are some other Deep Space Nine episodes that are scarily more relevant now than they were before. They're ridiculously more irrelevant to today's climate than they were back in the 90s. But this isn't one of them, because this episode doesn't feature a leader politician who is actively making the blight worse by trying to pretend it doesn't exist and keeping things open for his own political and financial gain. So therefore it's not really comparable. Although, how come none of these people are wearing masks? Well, I guess it's pointless. Anyway, sorry, totally different situation. Anyway, yeah, so the way, so it's a beautiful character story with Bashir, how he's come to realize that, and at first, like, his first instinct is to give up. Is to be like, I'm such an arrogant fuckhead, I'm out of my depth, I'm completely lost. And that's the idea that Irish Stephen Barry originally had. And I think this is like the most beautiful, perfect way to execute it. And so he feels like, yeah, I'm an idiot. I'm so arrogant, I thought I could save it. I'm just making things worse, I should go. But then his connection to Korea is what keeps him there. Now, let me get into what I really, really love about this episode. Why do I think this is one of the best episodes of the Star Trek franchise? Because I think this is the best character, one of the best, I should say, not the best. I mean, we got the Inner Light and Duet and whatnot, but it is one of the best character stories out there. I mean, and all of the supporting cast, well, the main two, really. But even some of the minor ones who don't have many lines are really good, too. But the main two, Korea and Trevian, are just so well developed. They're so interesting. And the interactions with Bashir, how they interact with Bashir and flesh out the situation. I mean, it makes it really complex. And it's just, I'm just in awe of how well these characters work. I mean, this is one of the best written episodes of all of the entire Star Trek franchise. I mean, that's for sure. I mean, the intricacies and the situations and the dialogue and how these characters behave. So, okay. So, let's talk about Ikoria, first of all. The way they slowly develop her relationship with Bashir and Jadzia, she had a nice little... I was almost sad when Jadzia left. Although they didn't really have that many more scenes when Jadzia left. They kind of blew by time quite quickly when it was just... They implied like a lot of time had passed, but we don't actually see that much on screen when Bashir decides to stay behind after Jadzia leaves. But when Jadzia is there, like, there's this beautiful... Like, the way all those three of those characters interact with each other, Bashir, Jadzia, and Ikoria, is just... It's like a symphony. It's like really beautiful, and there's something really simplistic and beautiful about it, if I'm repeating my adjective. But because Ikoria is, I mean, she's kind of innocent. In fact, like, Naren Shankar talked about how Ikoria was originally named Ikorio, and which is an anagram for rookie. Just like Trevian is an anagram for veteran, which I never looked at it in those terms, so that's actually pretty interesting. So Ikoria is seen as someone who's a little bit naive, but she's one of the few people who actually believe in Bashir, who are willing to trust him, because apparently the planet has had troubles with people in the past who were scam artists who would promise a cure, and they'd just they just screw people over, and so that's why everyone's really skeptical of Bashir. But she's not, because she's heard stories of like other cities and other countries where there are healers who actually try to take away the pain and get at this virus, but she, of course, she's too sick to travel there and can't go to places that far away, and so she sees Bashir as like an opportunity, and she wants to latch on. And because you get through their interactions how much she actually trusts him, and she grows to trust him more the more she knows him, because she can see that he generally is trying to help. And we do talk a lot about how Bashir is arrogant, which is what the show is about. It's about, oh, I can come in and solve this thing. But his motivations are pure. Like, he really wants to be there to help people. That is his main goal. His main goal isn't to, like, win the Nobel Prize or whatever, the Star Trek version of it, although I'm sure he thinks it would be nice. But he's not doing it just for, like, a selfish reasons. Like, for example, if you've seen BoJack Horseman, I'm just really watching that show again. I love that show. There's this character, something St. Clair, I can't remember, who's like in this war-torn countries, and he's, you think he's this humanitarian who's helping all these children of war and people who are suffering, but really he turns out to be an arrogant asshole, doesn't give a fuck about the children who are suffering from this war, and he's just there to boost his own ego and his own reputation and make more money. And that is not at all Bashir. Not in the slightest. He really does come at it from really pure motivations of wanting to help people. I think that shines through, and especially Ikoria can really tell and sense this the more she gets to know Bashir, and she learns to trust it. In fact, you have that one line where, and you get that, as I say, you have that great interactions, which is so well written between Jadzia and Julian and Ikoria, where Julian kept saying his, technical medical talk, and Ikoria is like, I have no idea what the fuck he's saying, and Jadzia, like, translates it. Oh, that means it's a good thing. She's like, oh. And I love that moment where she asks Bashir, it's like, oh, is that a good thing? He's like, oh, trust me, it is. And she says, yes, I do really trust you. And that bond is, like, real. It was well earned through the writing, and it's there till the end. That she does, in fact, the fact that she still has that bond with him, she is still willing to trust him, even after all those people died, after Bashir fucked up royally. I mean, god damn it, that was such a heart-wrenching scene as well, because it came right after that scene where Ikoria really opened up to Bashir and talked about Kukalaka, his teddy bear, which is the first mention of that, and it's mentioned again later on in the cards. So I like that continuity there. But right, because that was a really warm, heartfelt scene where we see these two characters bonding, but it's interrupted by Jadzia coming in, and then had that really heart-wrenching scene where people start dying. And I was going to say everyone dies, but really only one person dies. And it's that one guy who's a bit of an asshole to Bashir when he first got here. It's like, oh, you still here, blah, blah. And he actually ended up going to Bashir when he asked for volunteers. And so he trusted in Bashir. He's like, this better be good because I postponed my death for this. And it didn't work out for him. And that's really tragic. Now, he's the only one who I believe died directly from Bashir's meddling. But Trevine then comes in, and all these other people suffering ask to die because they're suffering. So he indirectly, if not directly, I mean, that's kind of arguable, killed pretty much everyone there. And then they imply, although it's never explicitly stated, but they kind of imply that everyone there wanted to kill themselves. Although you do see there's a few people, which I like. It's a nice touch because I never notice this, or at least I didn't notice this the first few times. But you see that when people start screaming, when that one guy starts screaming, a bunch of people start screaming in pain, there's a few people who just get the fuck out of there. Like, they run out. So they're not in pain, but they're like freaked out that everyone else around them is starting to die, and like, holy fuck, I am fucked, I better get the fuck out of here. Which I love And in fact, they never focus on that. Bashir just like glances at them as they go because he's too busy like trying to save lives. And I love subtle touches like that. In fact, I've noticed a lot of subtle touches like that I'd never noticed before with a lot of background. Like, this is a really well-directed episode, too, and this is what Ira Stephen Bear was talking about, too, how everything comes together in this episode. So then you have Trevine shows up, and he, kills a bunch of people because they ask him to, and, well, I'll get into Trevine later, but I love that after this moment, like Ikoria, because Bashir wants to leave. He's like, fuck this. He's really down on himself. He thinks that he totally fucked up and it's all his fault. And Ikoria is the one who still believes in him. And so he stays specifically to look after her. And you can tell, like, that she is dying. Like, she's suffering a lot worse from this disease. And he had that great scene where she asked for more painkillers, and she was like, I'm sorry, I want to, but if I give you more, it could hurt the baby. And she's like, fine. Because, of course, her goal is to see her baby born, is to live long enough so her baby can be born. God damn it. I mean, I'm trying really hard right now not to tear up. I think this is mainly why I love this episode so much, and I think it's one of the best episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. This is probably the most emotional, most heartbreaking moments, most effective heartbreaking moments in the whole show. Hell, I'd even put this above something like Duet or The Visitor. It's hard for me to say if it's more heartbreaking than The Inner Light. That's a tough one. It's at the very least it's on par. The moment where Ikoria gives birth and Bashir finds out that the baby's free of the blight, and Ikoria looks on the baby just long enough to see her baby alive and free of the virus, the first of her species in centuries ever to be free of the virus. And then she dies. And the look on Bashir's face, going through this like wealth of emotion of realizing that he did make a difference, that he did what he wanted to do, that he set out to do, is to have Ikoria live long enough to see her baby born. And also he found the vaccine. He found the way so all babies in the future could be born. And that swell of emotion combined with watching this woman who had helped him, who had believed in him, who had hoped in him, watching her die and not being able to live to see her baby, who is going to live a full life because of her, because she believed in Bashir, because she didn't give up on Bashir, because she encouraged him. And it's a change for her entire people. And the tragedy of her just having, not being able to see that, of dying right there. Like, I think this is the first time I've ever almost come to tears in one of my reviews. I think that is one, if not the most, is one of the most powerful scenes in all of Star Trek. And that's why I think this is definitely one of the best episodes of the entire series, if not the, and I think it's completely underrated to not be put really up there with the best of the best. Now, sorry, give me a second here. Let me get into Trevine, because this is another really great character, really great aspect of the show. Because, I gotta be honest here, and I'll get more, just getting more into my internal politics. So I'm getting a little bit political about assisted suicide, which is clearly a theme of this episode, particularly when Trevine is concerned. Now, it's funny that I'd learned that Trevine was actually an anagram for veteran, because I always thought Trevine was named, the character was named this way because it sounds similar to Kevorkian, I suppose, maybe a little. Dr. Kevorkian, if you're not familiar, was a figure in the 90s, a doctor who was known for assisting suicide. Mainly for patients who were terminally ill, who were just suffering and wanted to help people to end that suffering. There were a lot of like really tasteless jokes about him, but anyway, Trevine, there was one point when I really loved this episode shortly after it came out, that I thought to myself that it's like, wait a second, is this episode anti-assisted suicide? Because again, alright, my personal politics is I am a very strong proponent for assisted suicide, and I believe that it absolutely should be legal, and I think it's ridiculous to punish people charge them with murder or assisted murder for helping people in their suffering. In fact, for me, it was like an issue that I was probably most passionate about, and I get very angry over it and saying that it should be clear as day that it's cruel and unusual to force people to suffer through the worst things. Now, some people, maybe they could find a cure, maybe they could get better. In most cases, that is a very, very, very unlikely, and it shouldn't be up to some fucking government official to determine that. It should be up to the person who's actually fucking suffering. I'm sorry. You can see how passionate I felt about this. So, I had a bit of my own crisis because I love this episode so much for all the reasons I just mentioned. I was like, wait a second, this episode actually, attacking assisted suicide? But the more I looked at it, and particularly the more of the character Trevine, I came to the conclusion that it's not. It's not necessarily supporting it either. It's doing something that Star Trek rarely does. And that is presenting you, the audience, with both sides, or all sides, I should say, and just not making a judgment. Just presenting a situation and being like, what do you think? You as in the audience. You make up your own mind. Because the reason why I thought maybe it was anti-assisted suicide, because Bashir is typically our surrogate. He's the one we root for. He's our hero. He's the main character. He's usually the one who's the surrogate for the audience. And he was very much against assisted suicide. He was very much against Trevine. But the more I look at it, the more I see how, and I said this earlier, like Trevine is not the villain. There's some times where he's kind of portrayed, you could mistake that he's the villain, because there's a time where he threatens to kill Bashir, and that's villainous behavior, although not directly. He's basically, because when Bashir's in the public trying to convince people to help him in his research, Trevine, comes up and counters it and he's like, all these people promise all this other shit and they just end up leaving us worse. And Bashir's like, I'm not promising anything, I'm not making any promises. And Trevine says, well, see that you don't, because the other people came and made false promises, and their deaths made the quickening seem like a blessing. That's a pretty ugly threat. So I can see how some people might think Trevine's the villain because of that. But if you really look at this episode and you really analyze it, it does actually do a good job of presenting Trevine's point of view. And the fact that his name is the anagram for veteran, to me, that clues in even more. That he's the veteran. He's the one who's been through. In fact, they mentioned in this episode that he's one of the oldest people around, because most people usually don't survive the blight as old as he has. And he even mentioned, and I have seen more suffering than anyone else has. And that defines his character. And they make it clear, like, throughout the episode that his motivations do come from a good place. They come from a place of caring. He generally wants to help people. And it's something that Bashir, it's not because he's young and arrogant, but mainly because he had a different life. And he didn't live on that planet, in that situation where they were as doomed, as fucked as they are for centuries. And so he comes in with this Federation mentality, not like comprehending, like, oh, all life is precious sort of thing, not comprehending how living under such dire circumstances could really change and affect things. So he's trying to bring his own mentality. It's like, how dare you, help people kill themselves, where Trevine, I think very rightfully, is like, you're an outsider here, you don't fucking get it. And I don't think Bashir does, at least at first. Now, Bashir never really, like, champions Trevine's, like, oh yeah, go kill people. But I think he grows to understand him better and to accept, even if he still very strongly disagrees with Trevine's practices, he still comes to accept that, and especially because Akora even, like, pleads his case, like, Trevine's still a good person. So I think he comes to accept that Trevine's still a good person. And if you look at it, what Trevine is doing is that he actually does come from a good place, because he helps, because, as I said, people apparently on this planet live in destitution and poverty, so he gives them all these luxuries. He lets them sleep in a bed and have a bath and have all this luxurious food and have a nice time in love with family and loving and die under very idyllic situation. Because, and in this case, and this is why it's not really comparable to maybe modern times, because in this case, there's no question, there's zero question that the Blight will kill them, and particularly when they are quickening, which the whole episode's name of is, that shows the legions are inflamed, that there's no question that is the last stage before death. So anyone who has the quickening, it doesn't mean they're, to get lightning because they just killed another immortal. It means that they're going to die. And there's no uncertainty about that. It's like with 100% certainty, they are about to die. And so Trevine saves them from this prolonged, slow suffering and gives them dignity and gives them something they've never had, and lets them die in peace with their loved ones. And so I think that is a great thing, and I think that does come from a good place. But I also think that Trevine became really, and this is another thing that you do get sometimes the older generation, particularly when they've seen as much hell as Trevine has, is that he does get a lot more cynical. And has it in his own personal experience. He's seen a lot of other healers come in from other worlds, promise shit that they just can't deliver, and he's learned that there's absolutely nothing that can be done about this, and it's completely unstoppable. And so he sees Bashir's arrogant, oh, I can fix this in a week, and sees right through it as arrogance. He immediately recognizes this little shithead is being arrogant and doesn't know what he's talking about. And to be fair, he is partially correct. But because Akora had hope in him, Bashir didn't give up. And Bashir actually does manage to do what no one has done before and find a vaccine. And when Trevine is presented with the proof of that, when he sees the baby who's free of the Blight, he immediately switches to, yes, let's spread this vaccine. Let's cure as many pregnant women and their babies as soon as possible. And I'd love to, again, I'm almost getting teary-eyed because the line where Bashir says it's going to be a huge task to see that everyone gets this vaccine, and he says, not a task, a privilege. And that really shows you his strength of character right there. Despite anything he had done or the disputes Bashir had with them, that really shows his strength of character. And I also have to touch on the scene where he goes to Ikoria shortly before her death, when Bashir is looking after her, and he asks if she wants death, if she wants the way out. And she says no. She says that she's going to stick through it because she really, really wants to see her baby. And when he leaves, he says, I hope you live long enough to see her baby. And again, that's sincerity. He's a good person. It's coming from a good place. And he turned out to be right. Then we get the final scene where where Trevelyan takes the baby out to the public and shows it to everyone, and everyone's crowding around him, and Bashir's just off to the side. Nobody really notices him, and he's smiling. He does feel like someone who's been really worn, torn, and just tired, but he's smiling because of what he accomplished. Now, I think that seems a little unrealistic, because I do think that people would because everyone's just ignoring Bashir, but if, they would kind of know that it was the alien doctor who brought this vaccine, so I think they would be giving some praise to him and just not all of it to Trevelyan. But I like that it's more symbolic than anything else, because it shows that Bashir is not, this is what I mentioned earlier, that he's not doing this for prestige, that he's not doing it for, just so everyone can love him, just tell him how great he is, that he genuinely wanted to help people, so he doesn't give a fuck if he gets recognition or not from the people that he helped. That's not the point. The point is to help them, which speaks so highly of Bashir's character, so I do like that scene for that symbolism, even if it's not very realistic. And then, of course, you get Bashir returning to Deep Space Nine and still working, which is the best coda, the best way to end this episode. It makes it, again, uniquely Deep Space Nine to end on that dark term where he managed to find a vaccine, but there's still millions of people suffering, and he's still working at it, trying to fix it, and failing. And so even though he did manage nearly the impossible, he's still not perfect. And he still ultimately failed all those millions of people who are still going to die horrible deaths from the blight. It's hopeful, bright, but dark and dreary at the same time. And that is uniquely Deep Space Nine. I almost want to say it is the very best, but I do like those other two episodes of DS9 I mentioned as well, so it's hard for me to rank them. But one thing is for certain, that this episode is criminally underrated. Alright, so now I got all the heavy stuff all the way. Come to Quarks. Quarks is fun. Don't walk, run! Gotta talk about the opening scene, which I am saving for last, because I wanted to get into the main meat of the episode. But I don't know. Part of me thinks that it is a bit of a mismatch to have such a comedic scene and such a dark and serious and dreary episode. I mean, but on the other hand, it is maybe good to have that levity before you really get into the heavy shit. But I think this is one of the funniest scenes in the entire show. Where, if you don't remember what I'm talking about, Quark gets his advertisements all over Deep Space Nine. And they have the replicator. When O'Brien goes to use the replicator, it has these ads pop up. It's like, come to Quarks. Quarks is fun. Don't walk, run. And then you got Worf comes in, he's like, you! And Quark immediately goes and hides. And Worf is like, I ordered the prune juice in the mess hall. This is the bottle it came in. And it was like a can with a Quark's face, and he poured it halfway, and it's like, come to Quarks. Quarks is fun. And one of my favorite lines, and I mentioned this in my one-liner video because I forgot to put this in my top 10 one-lines of Star Trek, but I mentioned it in the comment section below. As immediately after that, Kira grabs Quark, and it's like, if all of your little advertisements are removed from the station by the time I return from the Gamma Quadrant, I will come to Quark's. And believe me, I will have fun. And then Quark, like, as soon as she leaves, like, O'Brien starts working on it, and Quark's like, oh, let me help you with that, Chief. I love that. Now, in practical terms, I mean, would Quark really be that scared of Kira? I mean, because Kira couldn't really beat the shit out of him with impunity. I mean, it would be kind of illegal, wouldn't it, to stop her or whatever. But still, it's still a great gag. I still love it so much. Come the Quark. But anyway, it does seem really out of place compared to the rest of the episode, but I don't know. It is a bit of a levity. So my rating for The Quickening out of 10 is, of course, a 10. The best. This is one of the best episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. Top 3 DS9, maybe even top 10 everything. I don't know, I didn't do a top 10 of everything. At the very least, top 20. Yeah, definitely top 10. Fuck. As I said, I put this up there with, like, The Inner Light. I put this up there with fucking Duet. I put this up there with City on the Edge Forever. This was so emotionally impactful. I mean, that ending where she gave birth and she died and the baby was free of the blight, like, that was one of the singular most emotionally powerful scenes I've seen in anything ever, not just Star Trek, anything ever. An amazing underrated episode. Anyway, that is it for my review of The Quickening. I'm going to give a thanks again for all my Patreon supporters, all those who voted in the poll, even those who didn't vote for this episode. I do want to thank you so much, especially for your support of the channel. It's very much appreciated. If you would like to support my channel as well, you can go in the link in the description below. We'll have a link to my Patreon. Even just as little as $1 a month will get you access to all my Patreon only videos, where they get to see, Patreon supporters get to see videos like this one a couple months in advance. And I also have pre-releases of other videos, as well as lists and other things. If you do $10 or more, you can get requests, videos for me to do, and whatnot. But your support is very much appreciated. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel for more Star Trek videos, as well as videos on many other shows like The Expanse and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.